Welcome to UO Today. I'm Steve Shankman, Director of the Oregon Humanities Center. Our guest is Frances Robinson, Senior Vice Principal for Research and Enterprise at Royal Holloway, University of London. While visiting the Oregon campus, he'll be giving a public lecture entitled The Christian and Islamic Reformations Compared. Frances Robinson is a distinguished scholar and a prolific author whose research interests focus on the Muslim world from the 18th century to the present. He earned his BA and PhD from Trinity College, Cambridge, and he's taught at the University of London since 1973. He was made Commander of the British Empire in 2006. He is the author of 13 books, including the Cambridge Illustrated History of the Islamic World, published in 1996, and translated into Turkish, Chinese, and other languages, and Islam and Muslim History in South Asia, published by Oxford University Press in 2000. His book, The Mughal Emperors, was published this year. He has 3 other books in progress, including the forthcoming Islamic Reform and Modernity in South Asian Studies. Welcome. It's great to have you here. And it's been, I guess, 36 years since we last saw each other, and you have accomplished a tremendous amount in those 36 years.
Kind of you to say so,
Yeah.
Steve.
Now tell me your title, Vice Principal for Research and Enterprise. What does that mean exactly?
I have to say, Steve, it's
Yes.
not what I do any longer.
I
but I'll
see.
tell you what
Oh,
you
good.
did.
Okay.
I'll tell you what you did.
Uh-huh.
Yeah, it meant that I was responsible for the whole research direction of the institution, which meant that I had a say and interest in the way in which jobs were described, organized, and where positions went. We have in Britain something called a research assessment exercise, which controls about 15 to 20% of the resource that comes into the institution if you're a good research university. And so it's enormously important in British universities to make sure that you maximize the income that comes down the research stream.
Mm-hmm.
So it was my job to make sure that our outfit was organized so that we could get the best possible outcomes from this 4 to 5 year quinquennial research assessment exercise.
I see. But you're not doing that any longer.
Thank God.
I
I'm not
see.
doing that.
So now you're doing research full time, and what about teaching?
I do a bit of teaching.
Mm-hmm.
I've actually just finishing 3 years sabbatical.
A 3-year sabbatical.
Yeah, isn't that nice?
Yeah.
And but throughout that period, I kept my research students on, or graduate students, you would call them. And I've got 8 now, and I find them a very important part of my life. When I was doing heavy administration, they really kept me alive. And they continue to keep me alive now that I've got a bit more time to devote to them. And I also teach one undergraduate course. Very important to keep in contact with the undergraduates.
So what kind of course is that? And what does that mean exactly? Is it a lecture class that students come to, or?
It means lectures, essays, everything. And this particular course is called the Islamic Revival from the 18th century to the present.
Hence your interest in that subject and your talk here at Oregon.
Indeed.
Yes. Now you've been researching the Muslim world for more than, I guess, well, obviously 30, maybe 40 years. Tell me how you got interested in that area.
Okay, it's a 2-stage process. I started off actually when I was at Cambridge, even before I went to Cambridge, wanting to study medieval Italy. I learnt Italian and went off to the University of Stranieri in Perugia and spent a lot of time in Italy. But when in my 3rd year at Cambridge, as one does, I went to look for a research supervisor, there was no one obvious in the institution at all, except for one man who taught me as undergraduate called Walter Ullmann, very distinguished scholar of medieval political thought. And he said, Francis, I've got just the subject for you. I know you're interested in Perugia, and I want you to study a man called Baldus. He was close to Bartolo di Sassoferrato, who lived in Perugia. And we've got all his works in the Wren Library, just next door. You won't have to leave Cambridge. Whereas, of course, the one thing I wanted to do was to go and spend 3 years in Italy doing my research. So I wasn't terribly pleased by that. So I went to speak to my research supervisor, my director of studies at the time, undergraduate director of studies, who is a very bright, up-and-coming historian of South Asia. And he quickly divined what was wrong. He said, well, what about India? I can promise you at least a year in India if you come and do India with me. And I said, fine. Just in the space of an afternoon, a trajectory changed. And the reason why it was quite easy for me to do that was I'd been brought up as a youngster in a world of Anglo-Indians, people who'd retired from India. So I was brought up in the village of Willingdon. It was the seat of a former viceroy of India. He died, but his wife used to open our church fetes in her trademark mauve. My early pre-prep school was run by a former colonel of the 8th Gurkha Rifles. The grandfather of an early girlfriend was the last director of intelligence in India. So India was all around. So it wasn't difficult to make that transition. Now, when I went to India, having been told you will look at northern India, I quickly discovered that the people who were really interesting from my point of view in northern India were Muslims. So that's how I began to work on the Muslim dimensions of the development of nationalist politics in India.
What was it about Islam? What was it about the Muslims that particularly interested you?
At that stage, it wasn't actually about being interested in Islam, although I had spent quite a formative period before I started research in Turkey, actually living in a village high up in the Taurus Mountains, which gave me some sort of insight into how a small Muslim community might work. Now, the reason why I was interested in Muslim politics in northern India was that was northern India was the centre of Muslim empires. And this was the area in which there were some really interesting political things happening in the 19th and early 20th century. But it was all politics, it wasn't Islam. So I think what I need to tell you is how I move from being interested in the politics of Muslims to being interested in Islam. Well, out of that research, which was done in the late 60s and early 70s, I published my first book, which was called Separatism Amongst Indian Muslims, the Politics of the United Provinces Muslims, which was all about the emergence of something called Muslim separatism, which was the background to the emergence of Pakistan. In that book, I had actually used the papers from Lucknow, just a small part of the papers, of a very important religious leader called Maulana Abdul Bari. When the book was published, his son, who'd gone to Pakistan at partition, discovered about it and got very interested. And when he came to London in 1976, he asked if I would go and see him. And I did. It was quite a difficult meeting initially because one or two things I'd written he wasn't too pleased about. He had to point out to me that his father's Chevrolet had not been paid for by funds raised for political activity, but by money given by a disciple of his. Well, in fact, I knew that wasn't right because I'd actually seen the invoice from the Bombay Garage. But there were one or two other things like that which meant our initial first half hour of meeting wasn't too easy. But after that, we got on hugely well. Meeting went on for 4 or 5 hours. At the end, he said, you know, I've got all our family papers in Karachi and the papers of several quite significant people who are associated with them. You can come and see them anytime. So, like a good opportunist, academic, I went off to see them in Karachi as soon as I could and discovered a quite extraordinary collection of papers, which began with the first known farman of the Emperor Akbar, went through all kinds of books and correspondence in the 18th and 19th century, lots of newspapers, up to a point that by the time you reached the early 20th century, you had daily letters in and out from this family of learned and holy people, a quite extraordinary collection, in fact, for any family, over 300 or 400 years. And then what I did was to microfilm all of those, and I spent a good 20 years working on them. And the importance of working with this was that it enabled me to engage with this Muslim world from within and get an inner understanding from the workings of family, their discussions about themselves, the ways in which they wish to represent themselves. So it gave me, if you like, my own particular take on the Muslim world and what it was to be and live as a Muslim.
So did you publish things associated with those papers, or did it inspire you in some other ways?
It happened in two ways. Yes, I did publish stuff that was associated with those papers, and brought all the stuff in a collected volume called the Ulama of Farangi Mahal and Islamic Culture in South Asia in 2001. But I'd argue that actually what was more important about all of that was it influenced the whole way in which I approached the business of writing the history of the Muslim world. And so, for instance, in 1982, Oxford University Press published something called an atlas of, not Oxford, it was Phaidon, published something called an atlas of the Islamic world since 1500, which was a very, very substantial publication, 100,000 words, lots of maps, lots of illustrations. But the whole argument of the atlas was a very good way to understand Muslim history is to see the interaction between those who are the transmitters of the central messages of Islam, ulama and Sufis, transmitting the Quran and the Hadith, that's tradition, and the means of how to make these things socially available and socially work in society, on the one hand, and those who wield power in Muslim societies on the other. And so if you looked at this tension at work in different Muslim societies through time, you'd have a very good way of understanding what was going on. So, yeah.
So let's turn now to the topic of your lecture, which was comparing Islamic and Christian reformations. I think our audience probably has some idea of when the Christian Reformation happened, and they're obviously not parallel in time. I wonder if you talk about just the theoretical problems or challenges of this kind of comparison and what you found.
Right. I think it's very important to understand that over the past 3 centuries, the Muslim world has been going through a great change in the emphasis in its piety. That for a long period, there was, if you like, a balance between a this worldly concern in piety, actually making things work on earth and so on, and otherworldly concerns, that is being concerned about your spiritual life and how that spiritual life works and serves you and so on. What takes place in it's stimulated by all the kinds of debates that have been taking place in the Muslim world up to the beginning of the 19th century. What takes place from the 19th century onwards is a shift in emphasis, for some, not all Muslims, a shift in emphasis towards a this worldly piety of social action. So you get a process of removing all elements of superstition from a religious practice. So there's no longer any thought that, for instance, that you can get a Muslim saint to intercede for you with God. There's the making available for the first time in texts that people can actually read the Quran and tradition. Up to this point, the Quran and tradition have been in Arabic, which of course very few people, say, in South Asia could read. So as in our Christian Reformation, There is a translation of the great texts into vernacular languages. And there's also the use of print for the first time. Muslims have avoided print, feeling that oral transmission was the only reliable way of transmitting information from, say, teacher to pupil and so on. And it's not until the 19th century that print is adopted. And it's adopted by the ulama, first of all, that's the scholars of Islam, because that's going to be the most effective way for them to, in a position where often they're being ruled from outside, to create a constituency for themselves in society at large.
So they weren't writing before the 19th century?
Of course they were writing.
Yeah, yeah.
Of course they were writing.
Yeah.
But the difference is before the 19th century, it's a small group of people, if you like, writing for each other. Once you move into the 19th century and you're in a position where you're being ruled from outside by European colonial powers, your learned men have had all the funds and money that supports them taken away. These people are only going to survive if they can build a constituency for themselves in society. And of course, using print, making texts available in languages that ordinary people can read is a key way of doing that. And so there's a great change that takes place amongst the scholars of Islam from the 18th through the 20th century. These people who up to this point have been almost entirely dependent upon Muslim rulers, from the 19th and 20th century onwards, are almost entirely relating to their societies at large, and supported only by popular subscription, and supported only because they provide services which people want.
Let me ask you about another aspect of the Reformation, the Islamic Reformation. This is what I've heard, and you're the expert, I'm not, that the notions of interpretation of the Quran in some ways became much more, I guess what we call now fundamentalist. Is that true? Much more, that in other words, the idea that the Quran was the direct word of God, sort of unmediated, as I understand it, and you may correct me, that this was also a product of this time. That earlier there had been more nuanced, more. Is that a myth?
No, I think you're spot on, Steve, if I say so. Up to the 19th century, or particularly up to the 20th century, perhaps we should say, rather than the 19th century, all revelation was mediated society to society through scholars. And so there was a great sort of tradition of learning which people drew on in order to try and make revelation socially useful. What the emergence of new knowledge from the West in the 19th century does, and the challenge of the loss of power does for Muslims, is they mean that many, not all, feel that they need to go back to the original texts, Quran, Hadith, and push to one side all this medieval learning in order to work again at the business of trying to make revelation relevant to these new circumstances in which they find themselves. So as in the Christian Revelation, in the Christian Reformation, there is an engagement with the Bible for the first time for many people. So in this Muslim world, there is an engagement with the Quran as a living text for the first time, unmediated through hundreds of years of scholarship.
But if you have a situation, as you're saying, in South Asia, and I don't know whether it was the case then, I assume it was, as it is now, where less people know Arabic and somehow you still have a Reformation, then how many people can actually go back to the text and see what it says? Now, I'm thinking of today in America, in so-called fundamentalist movements, I think people have very little consciousness of the fact that the New Testament is written in Greek. And if you want to try to understand what it means, you have to actually go back
Sure.
and read the language. So I'm wondering whether there's a parallel instance.
See, there are two things that I think we need to bring forward here. One is that there's been a great process of translation of texts into vernacular languages. Of course, for Muslims, the Arabic of the Quran is magical. But nevertheless, for daily use, there's a Quran in Urdu, in Bengali, in Canada, whatever South Asian language you want. Secondly, and this is particularly important, the business of interpretation has actually moved, it continues amongst the traditionally learned men, but it's moved into a lay world. People who are not traditionally learned haven't picked up all the traditions of interpretation. And this, of course, happened in the Christian Reformation and produced absolutely dynamic results and a great challenge to the authority of the church and so on. And exactly the same thing is happening in the Muslim world, with all sorts of people engaging with these texts in their own language for the first time and producing their own outcomes.
Tell me about the role of women in Islam in the Reformation, or in the you're calling it a Reformation.
Well, yes, okay. Women play an important role. One of the most. Let me give you one example. One of the most important. There's a very specific reason. We're talking about, first of all, a Reformation that is experienced in many, many different societies. So I'm going to narrow it down to India and colonial India. And in colonial India, the external world, the world outside the house, is largely controlled by the British. The one place where you could still regard yourself as living in a completely Muslim world was within the house. And with this sort of condition and positioning, educating women in how to behave as good Muslims became a particularly important matter. And there's a very famous book produced by a man called Ashraf Ali Tanvi called Behishti Zeva, The Jewels of Paradise, which was directed primarily at women and is designed to enable them to be the effective transmitters of Islamic tradition within their households. And in that sense play a role that's as important, if not more important, than that being played by their menfolk who lived in the corrupted world controlled by the colonial powers. So the role of women acquired a new importance in these rather special circumstances.
I'd like to ask you about modernity now in general, because we were talking about that off camera. Most people think of modernity as a Western phenomenon. What have your researches into the Islamic world taught you about modernity in a more global context?
Taught me that it's a great mistake to see modernity as a purely Western phenomenon. Different societies have their modernities, different societies, straight cultural traditions, as arguably even different individuals have their own modernities. And what my researches on the Muslim world have taught me particularly is that in some of the tensions that have been generated by this so-called Protestant Reformation in the Muslim world, you can see very many of the same attitudes and developments being underpinned as we would associate with modernity in our own tradition, such as tremendous emphasis on personal responsibility in belief underpins the growth of individualism. Also, the understanding that the prime actor in the world is man. That underpins a sense of the instrumentality of man on earth. there's also a growing sense of the value of the ordinary things of life and so on. These are all things that, if you read someone like Charles Taylor, you would associate with Western modernities. But you can see all these things being generated within this Islamic context without any obvious recourse to what's taking place in the West. But before you, can I just add one thing more? Which is, we also have to remember that some of the changes that underpin these processes in the West, the material changes, are also taking place in the Muslim world. Mm-hmm. We have the growth of capitalism. We have the growth of the modern state. So there are other developments of material change which we also have to see interacting with these ideological changes which are producing new aspects of the human personality.
Now, in the minute we have left, it's a very loaded question. Where does Al-Qaeda, Osama bin Laden, fit into the Reformation in 45 seconds or less?
I don't think he fits in at all, actually. He doesn't, arguably, one could take Osama bin Laden completely out of this process of religious change and see him much more as a product of a dysfunctional family in Saudi Arabia, as a man who was formed primarily by fighting some of our battles against the Russians in Afghanistan, and who objects profoundly, as many Muslims do, to the imperialist role which the West has played in his society over the past 200 years.
So he doesn't fit into this narrative?
He doesn't fit into this at all. I just add one thing more, that the Reformation has generated a sense of the need to act on earth. Some of that spirit, of course, is used by Osama bin Laden and his other senior leaders for their purposes.
Well, Francis Robinson, it's been an absolute delight having you with us.
Very nice to talk to you, Steve.
We've been speaking with the distinguished scholar, author, and visiting lecturer, Francis Robinson of the University of London. Thanks for watching.